I'll give you a lecture for an hour, and then I'll take questions from the floor so that we make sure that that I cover things that are actually of relevance to you. It says up here, I work for a company called LIC China. LIC China is the largest private documentary producer and distributor and syndicator in China. We produced 1,400 hours of programs last year, of which 1,390, maybe 1,395, were exclusively for the Chinese market. And only a very small number, maybe 5 hours, 10 hours a year, are made for the international market. It's significant that I make more money for the company with one documentary for the international market than they make making 100 programs for the Chinese market. So the first lesson I'd like to say is you have to think big when you make documentaries. If you want to make money with documentaries, you will not make it in your own country. It doesn't matter what country that is. Although I have an American accent, I live in England. I've lived in England since 1971 when I went there as a graduate student. England has perhaps the most sophisticated documentary market and the most mature documentary audience in the entire world. Most companies in England that make documentaries don't make money just from England. The economics of documentary production are such that you really have to reach out to the international market. And I'll draw a little diagram later on the whiteboard. But I think I should say first that if my wife saw my photograph and the words "making money from documentaries," she would die laughing. Because the first trick of making money in documentaries is marry a woman who has a better job than you do. It's very difficult. Documentaries, for the most part, don't make the makers lots of money. And documentary makers are in the business because they love telling true stories. If you're in the business to make money, get out now, because it's almost impossible to make a good living in documentaries. Some people have the strategy of they make documentaries as part of their output, but they also make music videos or television commercials, or maybe they work on feature films. And that, if that strategy works for you, fine. But the money is not in documentaries. And I know this sounds depressing, but it's not, because what happens is the people who make documentaries are the people who really want to. When I had a company in London, I was a partner in a reasonably successful company in London, we frequently picked up directors who were either television commercial directors, and they would make huge amounts of money making television commercials. They'd make a television commercial about soap powder or about shampoo, and they would get £250,000 to make the commercial. They'd shoot it for 3 days, and how many times can you shoot washing a person's hair? They made tons of money at it, but they had no job satisfaction. So they used to come to my company and say, please, can I make a documentary with you, just to keep their sanity. You all know Tony and Ridley Scott, the filmmakers behind feature films like Blade Runner. They started out in documentaries, okay? They made television commercials, and then they moved into feature films. And I can't say they got bored and came back to documentaries, but the company that I work with, I was a partner in London, we frequently made documentaries with the director Werner Herzog. And Werner moved from fiction film into documentary back and forth. He just alternated projects. So for some people, you need to have, you should know now that if you want to make a living at documentaries, you probably need to do something else as well, or marry the right person. I don't know any other quick way to do it. I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint first, just to show you what the problem with money is. The reason I'm doing it is I don't want the battery on my computer to die before we get to it. Let me say, I'll give you a quick tutorial in where the money comes from in documentary making in my part of the world. I can't speak about Malaysia because I don't know the details here, but I can talk about China or Japan or Korea quite happily because I work in those countries. When you try to finance a documentary, when I try to finance a documentary, I have an idea for a film, and I try to sell that idea to people who have the money, who will pay me and my company and my team to make the film that I have described to them. I pitch ideas. I never sell finished films. I don't make the film and then try to sell it. The reason for that is the money for sales is very small. I was going to draw a diagram, but maybe I'll just use hand signals. The commercial relationship between you, the producers, and the people who broadcast your film, whether it's broadcast on television or whether it's broadcast in the cinema, doesn't matter. The relationship between the two of you, the financial relationship between the two parties, can take one of four different relationships. At one extreme, it's you make the film with your own resources and try to sell the finished film. That's called an acquisition. They buy a finished film, finished television program from you, or maybe from a distributor, and they give you very little money for it. An acquisition is like going into a shoe store. Acquisition, when you go into a shoe store, you see all the styles of shoes, and you pick the pair you want, and you pay for it, and you take them home, and they're your shoes. That's what an acquisition is all about. The broadcaster or the cinema distributor will buy a finished film for very little money, tiny amounts of money. If the cost of production is $100,000, and I'm just taking a random number, just because it's an easy number to think with. If the cost of production is $100,000, you would sell it for $2,000 or $3,000. Even if you sell it to a very, very big broadcaster, the normal sale price is not very large. The BBC at the moment is spending between $10,000 and $20,000 per hour for a program. I'll put some numbers up on the screen if you bear with me. The point I'm trying to make we've got it. The point I'm trying to make is if you sell a finished product, you get a small amount of money. And I was just saying, if it costs you $100,000, the most you would get back from a broadcaster is, I don't know, between 2 and 5% of your cost of production. So if you think that you're going to get 5% on a sale, It means you have to sell your production to at least 20 countries before you get back just the money you spent to make the film. No profit, just to get back your costs. So acquisitions are not a very good way to earn money. What are the broadcasters willing to pay? And I'll tell you now, the clue is it's a buyer's market. There are so many good documentaries available to buyers, the broadcasters. For me, the main outlet for documentaries is broadcasters. It's a buyer's market. This is the golden age of television documentary. There are more good films being made now than any time in history. If you look at the films that just the American Oscars earlier this month, all 5 of those films were terrific. And yes, I did work on one of them, but I won't tell you which. But and we didn't win, so I didn't work on Sugar Man. But this is a good time because there's so many creative people out there making so many good films. But because there's so many good films out there, when you sell them, they're actually not worth very much. These are the figures. These figures are out of date. The last time I did this, updated the chart was 2 years ago. And so the figures have gone down, not up, but they've gone down. Those are the major countries in Europe that purchase documentaries. And you can see the minimum amount they were paying, this is per hour, and the maximum amount. And so you see there only are 3 significant markets in Europe: France, Germany, and the UK. Everything else, you're basically giving the program away. Okay, I don't know what your cost of production is. My cost of production is not at LIC, because the Chinese documentaries are cheap. But if I'm making documentaries for the international market, my cost of production on average is probably, it's in the range between $150,000 and $350,000 to get something that's good enough quality that people around the world will watch it. And this is a technical issue. This has nothing to do with the content of the film. We can talk about content later. But just in terms of the technical quality, the editing and the music and the camera work, the cheapest I would do would be $150,000 and maybe up to $350,000. But that's what it sells for. So you see, if every country on that list from Europe, those are the biggest in Europe, the other countries pay even less, it won't add up to the cost of production. And okay, you can say, let's add another continent. Those are the countries in Americas, both North and South America, that are the main buyers of documentaries. There's only one significant number up there, and that's the USA. And you see that the range for the USA goes from almost nothing, $3,000 per hour, to quite high. The reason there is a very high number up there is because HBO distorts the market. I have HBO in my hotel. I don't know if you have HBO available everywhere in the country. HBO does a small number of documentaries, but they are very, very expensive documentaries. The average budget on a HBO documentary is over $1 million US. So if you take HBO out of the equation, if you get rid of that distortion, most broadcasters in the United States pay a fairly small amount of money for documentaries. PBS, which is the main documentary broadcaster in the US, for the kinds of films that most of the people here in this room will make, maximum they would pay would be $80,000 an hour, and they will try to pay much less, $30,000, $40,000 an hour. Discovery and National Geographic are different because they're global channels. And if you want, I can talk about strategies for dealing with global channels again later. When I take questions from the audience, if you want to talk about that, we can. But right now, I just wanted to show you, with the exception of the United States, there's really, it's pennies compared to the cost of production. And you know, you might say, let's add another continent. There's not only Europe and the Americas. Why don't we add Asia? Those are the figures for the big documentary purchasers in Asia. And again, with the exception of Japan, the money's not really very significant. And if you add Australia and New Zealand, again, it's not very much. So if you've been doing your mental arithmetic and you've been adding up all the numbers in the columns, you would come to a grand total. What's your documentary worth in the global market? And the figure is actually quite small. If you sell to every single one of the countries that I had up there at the minimum amount, you would get $126,000 an hour. And I've told you, that's less than my cost of production. The cheapest documentary I work on is $150,000. Now, you can make documentaries cheaper because salaries are lower here and because possibly equipment costs or something are lower here. Certainly your time in the edit suite is lower here. So I know that when I say the cheapest I do is $150,000 and you're all doing mental arithmetic and you're saying, well, I can do it for $30,000, I know you can. But I don't think you'll sell the $30,000 documentary. The maximum amount, if you sold, if you added it up, I think there were 40 countries on my list. And those are the biggest 40 in the world. If you add it all up, it comes to $764,000. And you think, great, I'm going to be rich, I can retire. I can tell you now that very, very, very few documentaries go for the maximum amount. I can give you all sorts of horror stories. One of the documentaries my company made, I had nothing to do with it. It was my company, it wasn't me. That won the Academy Award in 2003 was Bowling for Columbine. Okay, it was a documentary about high school students in Colorado who used guns to kill other high school students. And it was presented by a man named Michael Moore. Now that documentary had a budget of $4.5 million. It was very expensive because Michael Moore flies first class everywhere. His assistant flies economy class, and then he tries to sneak her into first class, and the airlines don't let him do it. And he will never go back into economy class to talk to her. Now that documentary sold for $80 million in cinema tickets around the world. And it then added another $20 million in DVD sales and sales to television. And I don't know, Michael went on lecture tours and things. Yep, he got rich on it. He got very rich on it. But it's an exception. It's not the way most documentaries are made. You cannot count on his model to be your model as a business structure. And just to give you one other figure, it also had $18 million worth of lawsuits that were lost because people who he filmed for the documentary thought that they were abused or misrepresented. So that brought the gross profit down from $100 million to $80 million. But still, it was an exception. Now, the company I worked for at that time was Alliance Atlantis. And Alliance Atlantis is the people who make a drama serial called CSI. Does that play here? Okay. Shortly after we won the Oscar, the head of Alliance Atlantis development came into my office in London, and he said, could we do it again? And I said, it depends what you mean by it. There were 5 finalists for the Academy Award in 2003. 2 of the 5 finalists were Alliance Atlantis companies. One was a company in Canada. Alliance Atlantis owned 5 documentary production companies spread in Canada and the United Kingdom. Bowling for Columbine was made by one of the Canadian companies, and my company in London made the other one, and it was called Prisoner of Paradise, which is a film I'm sure no one here has ever heard of. But it did make it as a finalist for the Academy Award. So the boss comes in and he says, can we do that again? And I said, what? Get a finalist for the Academy Awards? And he said, yes. And I looked him straight in the eye and I said, absolutely not. I said, between the 5 companies, we are very, very good. Maybe we could get a finalist once every 2 years, but we would never do it once every year. I was fired the next week. And the company, all 5 documentary companies were shut down 6 months later because Alliance Atlantis said you're not making money fast enough. And that's when we were turning in $80 million profit. So it doesn't meet business models. It's very hard to actually make a profit in documentaries. And I can't read my thing because the colors have shifted, so I'll do it from memory. So the chart I showed you was about acquisition prices. And what I'm saying is you are shooting yourself in the head if you make a film and then try to sell it. That's not mine. What you want to do is sell the idea for the film before it is made and get someone else to put the money into making the film. So you can pay yourself a salary, so you can pay the rent. Now, I said at the beginning, there are 4 different financial relationships. The one on the bottom is acquisition. Above that, we have something called, well, let me go to the other end. I said acquisition is over here. Think of a continuum of color, a spectrum of color. This is one end of the spectrum, acquisition. At the other end of the spectrum is something called a commission. And in a commission, normally it's a broadcaster, sometimes it's a film fund, sometimes it's a government agency. But in a commission, someone pays 100% of the cost of production. They say, yep, I like your idea for a film. I've read your budget. I think that's doable. Here is the money. You make the film, and when it's done, I will own it. Okay? That's a commission. Now, that takes all the stress out of being a documentary filmmaker because they pay all the bills. All you have to do is be creative and make the film. The downside is because they've paid 100% of the cost of production, they own 100% of the sales of the film. So if, for example, the BBC commissioned me to do a film about the traffic problems in Kuala Lumpur, and they said, here you go, your budget's $100,000. Here's the $100,000, make the film, we own it, and we're going to show it on the BBC, and then we're going to sell it to Singapore, because Singapore wants to see about the traffic problems in Malaysia, because they want to laugh about it. Or we're going to sell it to Japan, or we're going to sell it to China, or we're going to sell it to France. Now, every time they sell it, they get the money. You do not get the money. There are no royalties in documentary television. In the English-speaking world, in France, it's a slightly different system because the French director has legal rights in the sale of anything he has made or she has made. But France is the exception. Most of the world does not work that way. So for a person like me, I actually don't want to commission because they get all the benefit of the film. So between these two ends, acquisition here and commission here, there's a big wide area that's divided into two categories. And this is where you make your money as a documentary filmmaker. Two ends. Closer to the acquisition end, there's something called a pre-sale or a pre-buy. And what that means is, again, I have pitched my idea to the funder, and they like the idea, and they say, we'll give you some money for it, because we want it. We don't really want it to go to another channel in our country, because we think it's going to get an audience. We don't want to lose it, but we also don't have a lot of money to spend. So what we'll do is we'll give you a pre-buy. We're telling you now we are going to buy it, and we're going to pay more than the acquisition price. So if the acquisition price is 5% of the cost of production, on average, a pre-buy is 10%, in the range 10 to 15%. So that means if it's 10%, you need, and you do it only with pre-buys, you need to get 10 funders to all agree to work on your film with you. You can do it, it's hard. The biggest co-productions I know had 17 partners. But think about it for a minute. If you have 17 people looking, or 17 different broadcasters looking at the rough cut, each one is going to want something different. They each see the film a different way because each of the audiences are different. So pre-buys are useful, but they're also difficult to get enough pre-buys to pay the cost of production. So we have acquisition, and then we have pre-buy, and way over here we have commission. This area here is filled with things called co-productions, and that's where the money in documentary is. Your ideal documentary will be co-production with 2 or more funding agencies. And in the West, those funding agencies are usually, not always, but usually broadcasters. Sometimes they're film funds, sometimes they're sponsors, sometimes there's a philanthropist or an NGO that particularly wants the film. Now, co-productions are good because the amount of money is substantial. Co-production is the co-production would, a broadcaster that joins in a co-production would expect to put 20% or more of the total budget onto the table. So it doesn't take quite so many co-production partners. I very frequently do 3-partner co-productions. I would get 40% from Britain, I would get 40% from the United States, and I would get 20% from somewhere else. 3 partners, it's a manageable number of parties in the discussion, can sit them down all in the edit suite at one time, look at the rough cut, look at the fine cut. Three organizations, they can find a way to work together. 17, very difficult. So we have acquisition, we have pre-buy, sometimes it's called pre-sale. When I'm doing it, I'm selling to them, so it's called a pre-sale. When they are talking to me, they're buying from me, so it's a pre-buy from their point of view. It means the same thing. And then we have co-production, and at the end we have commission. And nowadays, most films that I know of are paid for by several different sources, maybe 2 co-producers, and maybe 3 or 4 pre-buyers, okay? Now, you've done your arithmetic and you say, wait, that's got 6 people in the room. 2 co-producers, 3 or 4 pre-buyers. And 6 people is a hard number of people to get to agree on a cut. But here's the beauty of it. Pre-buyers never enter into the edit suite. A pre-buyer has no editorial input into the film. They're giving you the money and they're saying, look, we trust you. You're going to give us something we can show. We don't have to spend time in the edit suite with you. We'll give you the money and we'll take the finished product. In a co-production, because the broadcaster or the funding agency is investing more money, they also want more editorial input. They want to look at I've been talking so far about looking at rough cuts and fine cuts, but they actually frequently want to see a whole lot more than that. They want to see who you've selected as the composer so that they can approve whether the music works for their audience or not. They want to know who the narrator is because they want to make sure the voice works for their audience. They may want to know, who the scriptwriter is. They demand approval. And they can say, look, we understand that guy is an award-winning scriptwriter, but this is not a subject that that guy knows. We do not want him or her to write the script. So the more money the funder puts in, the more money from this end of the spectrum, the more editorial input they have. The closer people get to that end of the spectrum, the less input. The first time I worked for Discovery in the United States, it was a big budget. They were big budget films. They were landmark films on Egyptian pharaohs. There were 17 approval stages. And at each approval stage, they would give us a little bit more money. Because my company was in England, Discovery was in Washington, D.C., or Bethesda, Maryland. And they didn't know whether we would put the money on the screen, the blue screen, or whether we put the money in our pockets. And the fear for broadcast, and this is again, this has to do with co-production. The fear for broadcasters, particularly if they don't know you and if they're far away, is they have no control over what you do with the money. You could put it on the screen. You could put it in getting a better camera and shooting extra days, and you could be using it to make the film that they really, really want. But just as easily, you could be buying a Ferrari, or maybe with the money they give you, maybe a smart car or something, or taking your boyfriend or girlfriend on a cruise, or buying a flat, or paying your children's school fees. They have no control over the money. And if you're in Malaysia and if they're in England, for example, if you spend the money by going to the Seychelles on a holiday, there's nothing they can do about it. And they know there's nothing to do about it. The worst they can do is they can wave their finger at you and say, you're never going to work in England again. And you say, I never worked in England before. I don't care. Okay? And they know that. They have no control. So what they do is, this is another aspect of co-production. I can tell you now, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but the way the world works is you can have the best idea in the world, and the French or the Germans or the British or the Americans, those are the Japanese, those are the 5 main sources of funding to make documentaries. You may have the best idea in the world, and they love the idea. They are still not going to hire you to make it because they don't know that it's safe to send money to you. You're too far away. Well, the fact that you're too far away is actually not the issue. I mean, being 8 hours time zones away from England makes it difficult to make a phone call when you're in the edit suite and they're in the office. But it's not impossible. The real reason is not a language issue and it's not a time zone issue. It's just that there's nothing they can do to you if you misuse the money. So what they suggest doing, and what I suggest doing, and this is what I do on every single production I make, is I do a co-production with another independent producer or independent production company like you've got in this room. So if I want money from Germany, and it's a great subject, and I'm really confident that the German audience will like this film, I don't pitch it to the German broadcaster. I call up a colleague in Germany and I say, I'm going to email you a proposal. If you think this works for your audience, why don't you raise money in Germany and we'll make it together? Okay? That's what a co-production is. If I have a subject that I think will work in Australia, I don't pitch it in Australia. I know who the commissioning editors are. I see them all the time. I've just come from 4 days at a market where I'm first name basis with 50 commissioning editors. My best friend is a German commissioning editor. I will not pitch to her. I will go to a German company to pitch to her because it gives her the security that the money will go on the screen. Because if it's a co-production between me and my friend Chris, not Chris, sorry. The guy I was going to say is the last guy I worked with, but he's dead. So I'm sorry, I can't work with Chris anymore. But if I have Patrick Hurl from a company called Authentic pitch the film, they know that if the money goes astray, they can say to Patrick Hurl, you will never work in Germany again. You have to fix this. And Patrick will, because he's a German company. If he doesn't work in Germany again, he is bankrupt. His company will go down. So they have huge control over people in their back garden. And they have no control over people just one country away. You know, if I have a program in England that is appropriate for a French broadcaster, I will not, in a 1 hour time zone away, it's 1 hour flight away, we can be in and out of each other's offices on a daily basis if we need to be. Even in that situation, I will never pitch to the French broadcaster. I will find a partner in France who will co-produce the production with me, and we'll share the money. That's what it comes down to. And the French broadcaster will keep an eye on the Frenchman, and the Frenchman will keep an eye on me. And this has to do with efficiency in production. The one thing broadcasters are afraid of is that they will have to spend a lot of management time looking to make sure that what you're doing is good for their audience. Here's a tip. No broadcaster anywhere in the world is looking for the best documentary in the world. They don't care about the best documentary in the world. They're looking for the best documentary that fits their audience. And each audience is different. Each country's education level is different. Each country's knowledge of whatever the subject is different. In Germany, this is the average documentary viewer is 66 years old, white, university educated, and male. Okay, so the audience is skewed. So if you want to do a documentary about K-pop, Korean pop music, or M-pop, Malaysian pop music, no chance in the world in Germany. Okay, none. And again, if you want anecdote, I can tell you, I worked on a project that was about the K-pop singer Rain. His name in Korean is B, and translation is Rain. And the program was so successful in Germany that it shut the telephone system down at the Japanese broadcaster because so many viewers called in saying, oh, I missed the first 5 minutes. Are you going to rebroadcast it? NHK actually rebroadcast it 4 times in 2 weeks on terrestrial television because the audience was so big. The DVD of that program sold for, and I'm not exaggerating, we sold the DVD for $135 per DVD, okay? And yet I could not give the program away in Europe. We made all the money we needed out of Korea, Japan. We didn't need any money at all from Europe. But we had a program we were proud of. It was a good program. It's not the program isn't just about pop music in Korea. It's actually about much bigger, grander subjects about how Korea works. Gave it to one of my friends, who's a commissioning editor at Arte, which is a broadcaster that broadcasts simultaneously in France and in Germany. And it's the intellectual channel of continental Europe. And I gave it to him, and he looked at it, and he said, I love the program. This is absolutely fascinating. It's great storytelling. He said, my audience won't buy it. They would not watch it. I could give it to him for free. No money, but he would not put it on the air because he knew the program would alienate his viewers because they're old white guys, and the old white guys are not interested in pop music from Korea. Could not give it away, literally could not, because the Korean program is edited very, very quickly. Lots of flashing images. There wasn't a lot of music in it. In fact, the music was probably the most accessible part of the film. But Koreans edit in a very, very, they do lots of montages, lots of sequences of quick visuals. Whereas in Germany, they like watching talking heads. Okay? They love watching talking heads. The older the talking head, the more they will watch it. And so this is like in Japan, for example, or possibly China. When I make a documentary for America, you stay on the talking head for 3 or 4, maybe 5 seconds, and then you cut to a visual about what they're talking about, but we can keep their audio running. In Germany, they don't need the cutaway. They don't need the cut to what they're talking about. They're quite happy to see an old guy talking. And you can stay on an old man's face. If he's got a white beard, you can stay on his face for 20 seconds, quite happily. And if you have 2 old white guys talking to each other, you don't need another shot. You can do the whole film that way. So what works in one country doesn't necessarily work in another country. Now, if you do a co-production with Germany, I'm assuming no one in this room has ever watched a German documentary. Maybe you might watch one of the Werner Herzog ones or one of the famous ones. But in general, you don't have access to German documentaries, so you don't understand. You have no access to the German market. You don't know how German audiences watch the film, which is another reason why you co-produce with a production company in Germany, because they know how their audience watches the film. And when you make the cut, when you're looking at the film together, your German partner can say, that's not going to work, too fast. Or you can say, that's not going to work, too slow. And then you can figure out how to make it work. And sometimes you can make it work for both countries. But it's really hard. And my secret to success is, aside from marrying a woman with a better job than mine, my other secret of success is I'm quite happy to make more than one version of the film. So again, I'm going to be anecdotal for a minute, but I'll talk about, I made a program that was a 50-50 co-pro between Discovery in America and Channel 4 in the UK. And Channel 4 is a youngish audience. It's not the youngest. It targets 25 to 35-year-olds. There is another channel that targets 18 to 25-year-olds. So there is one channel that's a bit younger. But Channel 4 and Discovery felt like it was going to be a good fit. Made the film. It was a history program. And Channel 4 loved it. They took it, they bought it, they showed it, no problem. Discovery rejected the program. And I don't understand it. How can it be perfect for Channel 4 and imperfect to the point of they refuse to accept delivery on it for Discovery? And that's when I learned the hard lesson that even though Brits and Americans speak roughly the same language and share roughly the same culture, storytelling is so different in the two countries that we actually ended up making two versions of the film. Again, I was going to use the board, but people in the back won't be able to see, so I'm going to do the graphic with my hands. In Britain, where there are no commercial breaks, you tell a story, you expect the audience to watch from beginning to end. We're spoiled. We think they will watch that way, even though they have a remote control. And you start at the beginning, and you keep getting more and more and more and more and more exciting until you get to the big bang at the end. It's like a crescendo in music, and you get to the conclusion, end of program. And it's basically a parabolic curve. Starts down here and just keeps getting better and better. Now, it's not a smooth line. Of course, the little jagged bumps on it as you go ahead, because you change the pace and you have fast bits and you have slow bits, but it's basically a parabolic curve. Discovery has 4 internal breaks, so your average segment of the program is only 8 minutes long. It's their television hour is 45 minutes or 47 minutes. So if you visualize what the storytelling, the story arc of the film is, think of a heart monitor. And it goes up, and it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down. You have to go up and get to the up point just before a commercial break, because you desperately want people to come back after the commercial break. But after the commercial break, it goes down for a bit before it starts building again. 2 entirely different ways of telling the story. My story, it was a history program. For Britain, I told it in a chronological way. It starts with biblical times, it goes through medieval times, then we get to Shakespeare, and then we get to the invention of radio, and then television, and then the internet. And I put it in that order. My best shot in the film was a story, or the best sequence in the film was about, this was a history of technology. The program was about ghosts in machines. And if you study ghosts in machines, I don't believe in ghosts, but some people do, but I have no comment on whether ghosts exist or not. But what was interesting was ghosts are always one step ahead of people in technology. So when the camera was invented, there were ghost photographs. And the most famous one is when, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, was sitting in a chair in her widow's clothes. And behind her, there's an image of Abraham Lincoln with his hand on her shoulder, comforting her. And that started a craze that lasted for 20 years, that went all over Europe and North America, anywhere where there was a camera. People wanted to have photographs with their dead relatives in the background. And then when the radio was discovered, people started hearing the voices of their dead grandmothers off the radio. And I mean, you guys are too young, you don't even know what radio is, but when television was invented, you know the static on television, maybe you don't even have static on television anymore, but there used to be your screen, because the television channel wasn't broadcasting all the hours of the day. If you turned on your television when they were not broadcasting, and then all the noise on the screen, people would see images of dead relatives, or they would hear dead relatives' voices. And then when the computer was invented, people would get up in the morning and they would say that they saw a message from their grandmother or something. And it was always with very specific information, so they knew it had to be their grandma. And so I was doing a program just looking at this interesting phenomenon where ghosts and machines seem to coexist. And I told it chronologically. Start with a story. The first literature we have in English that has a ghost in it is the Bible. And then, talked about ghosts in literature, and we get to Shakespeare and stuff. And it made perfect sense, and I was building and building and building to this great conclusion. And Discovery said, you have to put Lincoln first. Our audience will like Abraham Lincoln. We know who he is, so make him the beginning of the program. And I'm saying you can't make him the beginning of the program. No. For Discovery, he was the beginning of the program. So I'll end in just a second, but I just want to make two other points, maybe three other points about co-production. I ended up with one version of the program for Channel 4 in the UK and one version for Discovery in the United States. The Channel 4 version was 52 minutes long, and it was a script that had 6,000 words in it. And for me, that was an enormous script. That's counting all the interview and everything else. But every spoken word in the program, whether it was narration or whether it was archive footage or whether it was interview, if you add up all the words, it was 6,000 words in 52 minutes. Discovery was, I think it was 47 minutes at that time. So that means it's a 10% shorter film. And it had a 9,000 word script. Because in England, the audience was happy letting the picture tell the story. In America, they were afraid of silence. You had to cover every single shot with words. So it was shocking to me that when you do a co-production, you don't end up with an average between the two parties, the wishes of the two partners in the production, which would give you the lowest common denominator program. What we frequently end up doing is we make two versions of the program, or sometimes more than two versions. If I did a program last year where 50% of the budget was China, 50% was Japan. They both were significantly different programs, although it was about a bird. It was about a bird on the verge of extinction, and the Chinese and the Japanese worked together to save the bird from becoming extinct. You would think I would think that one version would work for both parties. No, we had to make two different versions of it. And I'll give you an example, and I'm sure you can find it on the internet. The Academy Award winner for the best documentary a couple years ago was called March of the Penguins. And it's a natural history film. It's about penguins. It's in the Antarctic. It's cold. What else is there to say? There are two versions of that film. The French version, and it was made by a French production company. The French version has the penguins, anthropomorphizes the penguins. It attributes human emotions and behavior to what we see the penguins doing. So it's almost as if there's a mommy penguin and a daddy penguin and a baby penguin, and they talk to each other like Happy Feet or something. The French version and the American version were identical. All the Americans did is they changed the French language to English. The British version, totally different script, because in Britain, we don't accept animals having human emotions. We think that's an improper thing to attribute to animals. So you can't say that this penguin loves that penguin or hates that penguin. No, that's not what's happening. So even in something as simple as a natural history program, we make different versions. The last point I want to make, because it's about making money in documentaries, is that it's very, very, very hard to raise 100% of your budget from a single source. And we can talk about the reasons why it's difficult, if you want later on. I think most commissioning editors, the people whose job it is to make decisions about what programs will be funded by a television channel or by a film fund, the National Film Board of Canada or Screen Australia or the British Film Institute actually are also funders in documentary filmmaking. In each case, there's someone who has the job to decide, is this a good idea? Should we spend money on this or not? And commissioning editors are risk averse. They are scared of taking a chance. If they get it wrong once, if they make a bad decision once, it's okay. If they make two bad decisions, they're out. It's a very cutthroat business. So it's very difficult to find a commissioning editor who will fund a film entirely. There are also financial reasons why it is difficult to get one party to fund a film entirely. You know, my little chart, that chart, although it was the acquisition price paid to purchase a finished film, the same figures are about what each of those countries would pay to be a partner in a co-production. So again, there are only 5 countries in the world that make a difference in terms of significant money. But if you remember the chart, the big numbers were coming from Germany. I think it was up to 120,000, France 80,000, UK 50,000, US kind of unlimited because of this distortion from HBO. Japan, I don't know, maybe another, they put 60 to 80,000 into a documentary. But as I said, most documentaries cost more than that. So you have to bring partners together. In a co-production with a filmmaker, with an independent production company like yourselves, but in another country, if you co-produce with them, it's also going to add to the cost of production. It'll add 30%. So if your film costs $100 to make it yourself, once you have a partner, your best friend from Germany or from Malaysia or wherever the partner is from, the cost will go up to $130,000. Because I mentioned you make different versions, there are more costs in terms of getting cuts back and forth between partners. There's more cost. It's actually easier to raise more money than less money when it's a co-production. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but it's hard to get $100 to make a film. Most broadcasters, the most they would put in would be 2/3 of your budget. So let's think in terms of $65. They'll put $65 in. Where do you get the rest of the money? Well, if you have a co-production partner, they can get $65 from their broadcaster. I can get $65 from my broadcaster. It adds up to $130, the magic number. Whereas if I try to raise $100, it's actually hard for me to get $100. It's hard to get 100% of the budget out of one country. It's not so hard to get 65% of the budget out of one country. 2 65s equal 130. So the co-production is easier. Although it's more expensive, it's actually easier to raise the 165 than it is to raise 100.